welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're really getting into the thick of it with the Russia-Ukraine war. It just keeps evolving, doesn't it?
It really does. So much happening.
Yeah, so we've gathered quite a range of sources for you. We've got news reports, Newsweek, AP News.
Right, and some analysis pieces, too, from the European conservative, the American conservative, places with definite viewpoints.
Definitely. Plus, a Reddit thread to get a feel for public chat, and importantly, a new Pew Research study on how Americans are seeing things.
So the idea today, our sort of mission, is to pull out the key insights from all this. What's actually going on? What are the different takes?
And maybe, just maybe, figure out what it could mean going forward, without getting totally lost in the weeds, hopefully.
Exactly. Cut through the noise. And what's really interesting, I think, is how all these pieces connect the politics, the diplomacy, or lack thereof, public opinion.
And even how information itself is being, shaped or weaponized.
Precisely. It's a whole web.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with former President Trump. His recent comments and actions seem pretty noteworthy.
Yeah, definitely. Especially after that really awful attack in Kyiv Thursday, April 24th, right?
That's the one. Terrible reports, at least 12 killed, many injured.
And then Trump posts on Truth Social telling Putin, "Stop, P. Just stop."
Which is, quite a turn from some of his earlier stuff, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Remember him suggesting Zelensky was dragging things out, the killing field comments, blaming him for not giving up Crimea?
Yeah, I do. So this direct SOP to Putin, it feels different. Maybe a shift in public stance. Or just reacting to the sheer horror of that attack.
Could be either or both. It's a notable moment for sure.
And it's not just reacting. He's also talking about setting his own deadline to get a peace deal done.
Right, pushing this idea that he can fix it, and quickly.
And he's framing Russia not taking all of Ukraine as, and this is his phrase, a pretty big concession.
Which is an interesting way to put it.
It is. And he's saying, both sides want peace. It feels like he's trying to set the stage for a certain kind of negotiation.
Definitely laying groundwork. That concession language is key. It sort of normalizes the current lines of control, which,
It's exactly what Ukraine says is completely unacceptable.
Precisely. A total non-starter for Kyiv.
And then there was that odd detail, Secretary of State Marco Rubio pulling out of that London ceasefire meeting, April 23rd. Just canceled it last minute.
Yeah, logistical problems was the official reason.
Which brings us to this leaked document, this supposed 7-point peace plan from Trump. The sources call it controversial.
That seems like an understatement based on the details. This seems to be the core of his potential approach, pieced together from the European conservative and that U.S. views summary.
Okay, walk us through it. What are the main points?
All right, so point 1, recognition of Crimea as Russian. Just straight up.
Okay, big one.
Huge. Point 2, de facto recognition of the other Russian-occupied territories, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia.
De facto meaning in practice, but not legally signed away.
Exactly. They'd basically be treated as under Russian control, even if Ukraine doesn't formally agree on paper. Third point, Ukraine banned from joining NATO. Ever.
Another major Russian demand met.
Yep. Fourth, lift all U.S. sanctions on Russia that have been imposed since 2014.
Wow. All of them.
That's what the sources suggest the plan includes. Fifth, restart U.S.-Russia economic ties, get business going again.
Okay, what else?
Point 6 is interesting. U.S. companies getting to exploit Ukraine's mineral resources.
Wait, U.S. companies?
Yes,
Yeah.
with some kind of unspecified compensation for Kyiv towards reconstruction.
Unspecified. Right, and the last point.
Shared U.S. control of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, making it neutral territory.
Shared U.S. control. With Russia, presumably.
The sources imply U.S. control as neutral territory, maybe oversight. It's a bit unclear, but definitely involves the U.S. directly at the plan.
Okay, that is quite a plan. Giving up territory, NATO aspirations off the table. What's the reported justification for proposing this?
Well, according to that AP report about his meeting with Norway's PM, part of his thinking goes back to Crimea in 2014. He apparently said it was taken without a fight.
Which isn't quite how many remember it, with the political upheaval and the contested referendum.
Right. It wasn't a full-scale battle like 2022, but without a fight overlooks a lot. The broader rationale seems to be, as we said, that Russia stopping where they are is the concession.
And the American conservative piece hints that maybe Putin's moves, like that temporary Easter truce mentioned, are designed to keep the White House, or a potential future White House, interested in exactly this kind of deal.
That's definitely one interpretation. Keep the door open for a U.S. brokered deal, possibly on terms favorable to Moscow. Putin knows the U.S. role is critical.
Okay, so unsurprisingly, this plan, or even the idea of it, hasn't gone down well everywhere. The reactions sound pretty intense.
Oh, absolutely. Newsweek quotes John Bolton, former national security advisor.
Always outspoken.
He called it a disaster for American national security. Pretty blunt.
Can't get much clearer than that. Others.
Representative Don Bacon is quoted making it clear, this war is Russia's fault. Full stop.
Placing the blame squarely.
And then you have voices like Yuri Boyachko from Hope for Ukraine expressing real shock and worry that no actual deal is signed, fearing the U.S. might not stick with Ukraine long term.
And saying Ukraine won't surrender no matter what.
Unequivocally, even if U.S. support were to dry up, they'd fight on. That's the message.
And what about Ukraine's official view?
The summary we looked at says they see this kind of proposal as a betrayal, extremely unbalanced, basically selling them out to Russia.
And Zelensky's position hasn't changed.
No, he's been absolutely firm, recognizing occupied territory is a red line, non-negotiable.
We're also seeing pushback from Europe, right? The French Foreign Ministry.
Yeah, AP reported they're countering the idea that Ukraine is the one prolonging the war. They point the finger at Russia for slowing down talks.
So for many in Europe, the focus is different. It's about getting Putin to agree to a ceasefire first.
Seems to be. An unconditional ceasefire. That's a very different starting point than Trump's proposal, which basically starts with massive concessions.
But then you have the European conservative piece arguing, well, something quite different.
Right. They essentially say, look, Trump is the only one putting any kind of concrete plan out there to end this. They argue Europe doesn't really have its own viable alternative.
That's a stark view. Kind of a, maybe it's bad, but it's the only option on the table argument.
Sort of. It highlights a real potential split. Some might see Trump's plan as pragmatic, maybe a painful way out, while others see it as pure appeasement.
And then adding another layer, the American conservative piece talks about the embarrassment among other U.S. officials.
Yeah, and this perception that Trump maybe doesn't grasp the core issues, the ignorance aspect they mention, it suggests internal U.S. disagreement and concern about the basis for these proposals.
Which could really damage U.S. credibility, couldn't it? If allies or even people within the U.S. system think the policy is based on a misunderstanding.
Absolutely. It erodes trust and makes diplomacy incredibly difficult.
All of this division really seems to reflect that wider partisan split in the U.S. that the Pew Research study highlights, that July 2024 data.
It really maps onto it quite clearly. The top line finding is striking. Americans are almost perfectly split, 48% yes, 49% no, on whether the U.S. even has responsibility to help Ukraine defend itself.
Wow. Almost 50-50.
Yeah.
But it breaks down along party lines.
Very much so. You've got 63% of Democrats saying yes, the U.S. has that responsibility, but only about a third, 36% of Republicans agree.
That's a big gap. And what about the amount of aid?
Similar divide. Nearly half of Republicans, 47%, say the U.S. is giving too much aid. For Democrats, that number is only 13%.
So fundamentally different views on the U.S. role and what's appropriate.
Exactly. And Democrats worry more about wider consequences, Russia invading other countries, Ukraine being totally overrun.
Is there anything they agree on?
Sanctions, actually. Majorities in both parties approve of tough economic sanctions against Russia, so there's still some common ground there.
Interesting. But Republicans are generally more pessimistic.
Yeah, slightly more pessimistic about Ukraine's chances militarily. And maybe most significantly, the share of Republicans who see Russia's invasion as a major threat to U.S. interests has dropped quite a bit.
Okay, so that political division is crucial context. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in potential Russian influence and disinformation. That AP story about Ben Swan, that's quite something.
It really is. This journalist, Swan, known for promoting conspiracy theories,
right.
He produced this 12-part series, Zelensky Unmasked, very critical of the Ukrainian president.
And the funding.
That's the kicker. AP reports his company, Rebel Media Productions, got over $6 million in less than 2 years from Russian state media, RT specifically.
$6 million from RT to produce anti-Zelensky content.
That's what the investigation found. And this content didn't just sit there. People like Donald Trump Jr. promoted it, called it explosive, highlighted the U.S. aid figures.
So Russian-funded content amplified by prominent figures in the U.S.
seems to be the pattern. Swan claims he keeps his Russian-funded work separate from his U.S. stuff. But AP found overlaps. Guests appearing on both his RT shows and Zelensky Unmasked. People like Tara Reid, Andrei Telizhenko, Scott Ritter, some familiar names often seen on RT.
And Swan himself basically admitted Russia probably likes his anti-Zelensky message.
He acknowledged that, yes.
And what about the legal side? Didn't he have to register as working for Russia?
His company did register with the DOJ under FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, but they apparently stopped filing the required reports back in February 2025.
And even the marketing firm he hired didn't know about the RT connection.
They claimed they were unaware and cut ties once they found out. Plus, that community note on Twitter, or X, added to Trump Jr.'s tweet.
Pointing out the RT funding.
Exactly. Flagging it up as likely disinformation linked to Russia, it shows the concern is out there.
This ties right into what U.S. officials have been warning about, doesn't it? These Russian influence campaigns.
Absolutely. Trying to undermine support for Ukraine, disrupt elections, sow division, funding, and spreading narratives like Swan series is a textbook tactic.
So, pulling back to the bigger picture, what does all this mean for NATO, for European security?
Well, the big worry is clearly that Trump's stance, especially if he were to push that peace plan, could seriously weaken NATO.
So,
If the U.S. signals it's backing away from Ukraine, willing to accept Russian gains, it sends a message to Russia, maybe emboldens them, and it makes other NATO allies question the U.S. commitment, Article 5, the whole collective defense principle.
undermines the whole alliance.
Potentially, yes. It could erode cohesion and credibility.
And we saw that note about Brussels and London trying to step up, working on strategic autonomy, common defense.
Exactly. It suggests Europe is already thinking about maybe preparing for a future where they might need to rely less on the U.S. security guarantee, hedging their bets, perhaps.
Though Europe itself isn't totally united on how to proceed either, right?
No, there are definitely differing perspectives within Europe, too. But the potential shift in the U.S. position is forcing some recalculations.
Okay, one last source point.
Yeah.
That Reddit discussion you look at in Our Conservative about the Kyiv bombing.
Yeah, just a quick snapshot. The general vibe there seemed to be a strong desire to just end the war, find a settlement, negotiate.
Less focus on assigning blame, more on just stopping the fighting.
That was the sense. And also some skepticism about Ukraine's chances of winning outright and questions about how much the U.S. should keep pouring in.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We're looking at, well, a mess, frankly, a really complicated picture.
Definitely complex. You've got these starkly different ideas about how to end the war. Trump's potential plan versus, say, Ukraine's red lines.
You've got deep divisions inside the U.S. about what America's role should even be.
Right. That Pew data really drives that home.
And layered on top of all that, you have these active concerns about disinformation, about Russia trying to manipulate the narrative.
Yeah, the Swan case is a pretty clear example of how that might be working. It's this collision of geopolitics, domestic politics, information warfare.
And ultimately the fate of Ukraine hanging in the balance.
Exactly. The interplay between the leader statements, the diplomatic proposals or lack thereof, public opinion shifts, and these influence operations. It's all happening at once. It's as much a political and information fight as a military one.
It really is. So much to consider. Which leads us to the final thought for you, the listener. Given all these different viewpoints, these competing strategies, the potential consequences, what do you think is the most likely way forward here? And maybe more importantly, what's the most desirable path? What role should the U.S. ideally play in trying to resolve this conflict?
Definitely something to ponder. There are no easy answers.
None at all. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.